I got the blues, but I don't mind. All I have to do is get to you, and then I feel just fine. I'm on a down, but not all the way. When I'm feeling low, you do your thing just so, and then I feel okay. You're so good.
What up?
The way you give.
What up, y'all?
So good. You're the best there is.
I forgot to put the thumbnail up there, man. Damn.
I got the blues, got it all so bad. When I think of me, it's hard to be a person quite so sad. You got the answer, and it makes me glad. When I feel that slow, you give me rock and roll, and then I feel it bad. You're so good, the way you give. You're so good. You're the best there is.
Yeah, that's dope. No, that's Lavi Saphir, man. He was back in the 70s, man. This is couples in the 70s. That's the Jay-Z sample and the Eminem samples. It did, man. It did. Jay-Z actually used that cut for The Streets Is Watching, man. What's up, Archie? How you doing?
He left no time to regret. Kept his dick wet with his same old safe bet. Me and my head high and my tears dry. Get on without my guy. You went back to what you know. So far removed from all that we went through. And I took a troubled track. My odds are stacked. I go back
What up?
to black. We only said goodbye with words. I died 100 times. You go back to her and I
What's up, George? What's going on, brother?
I go back to us. I love you much. It's not enough. You love blue and I love purple.
I love Amy Winehouse, man.
And life is like a pie. And
I'm a tiny
penny
laying
rolling
up the walls inside. Right on, Hallie. Right on, man. Thank you. I might play a little bit of it, man. Start off, man. Look, man, it's time to win, man. Yeah, I'm gonna play a little bit of that too, man. Good call, Hallie.
We only said goodbye with words. I died 100 times. You go back to her and I go back to
Think so?
I go back to we only said goodbye with words. I died 100 times. You go back to her and I go back to we only said goodbye with words.
Hey, y'all do me a favor and hit share if you got it on Facebook. Hit share to Facebook. I want to see something. So I'm running a test right now. I dig it. You know, she wrote this song right after the last lynching that happened in Marion, Indiana. All right, man. This is my group of Black Keys, man. Fantastic band, man. I mean, lovely band. Lovely, lovely. All right. All right, y'all. What's going on, man? How you doing? Thank you so much for coming this fine evening. Good evening. Good evening. Yeah, so, man, how y'all doing, man? I wanted to first say what's happening. Thanks for showing up. You know, Kansu and I were talking about the, Kansu and I were talking about Dr. Thomas Sowell. And I have degrees in economics. And Dr. Thomas Sowell is actually the reason why I studied economics. He was a He was actually the first black man on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. So he was one of the first. He actually helped determine monetary policy for this country. You know, I think there's only seven. There's seven men. So they've decided that this man was so smart that they put him there, man. He was a brother. And not only he was a brother, he was the first brother. He was so outstanding, you know. It's like the guy was so outstanding, he knocked his socks off. And I read about him in high school, in the high school economics class, and I said, "Damn, man, I want to be like him. I want to go say I'm going to work for the Federal Reserve Board. I want to go do that. I want to be an economist. I want to, you know, help determine monetary policy." And so I went there, man, and I was all in it, man. He battling with the porno watchers. Yeah, that's right, man. You know what's going to happen, man? Actually, watch times are up like crazy. So they're home, man. People are home bored and look for something to do, man. So they say, let me get on YouTube and I'm gonna look up something. So first, man, Kansu, Ogad, myself, and Sam Ant, we do a show on Fridays on Hip Hop News Uncensored podcast and Uncensored Truth podcast channels, and we do it as it's a financial Friday. So we did today's show, and I was gonna play Hanlon was there, so I'm gonna play just a little bit of it, and then we're gonna play some of the Black Rednecks, which is a fantastic book, man. So let's go to it real quick. I know God, he's not gonna trip on us, man. He's a good dude, man. So all right, hold on a second. Let me get there. So just bear with me, y'all. Okay. We were dropping some jewels, man. Okay. It's a terrible time to fully admit only. Wow, man. Dang, that's messed up. That's wow. Okay. That's odd. Don't know why that would happen, but okay. Sometimes, man, I don't understand. But okay. Anyway, let's get to this, man. What's zero? What's going down, man? All right, y'all. So let's play this, man.
You doing tonight, bro?
I feel blessed, man. I feel real good. It was a beautiful Friday afternoon out here in Jersey where we lay our heads at, man. Everything shut down. Ain't nothing going on yet. Right. But all in all, it's a beautiful thing. And they ain't stopping us from moving here at the Hip Hop Uncensored Podcast live on this Friday evening. Make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you hit that notification bell. We got our brothers in the building like we do every Friday. Kansu to God, CEO of Aboriginal Consultant out in Chicago. And our brother Darren Marion, CEO of Rattel SEO out of Indiana. Brothers, how y'all doing this evening?
Dope, man. Can't see it, man.
Yeah, man. Well, it's Financial Fridays. We're going to get to our special announcement real soon. But the people in the chat room, when you're coming in, man, drop your area codes, and we'll definitely be able to shout those out momentarily here on the podcast. And always smash that like button too as you come in. As you know, man, that's you do us a favor by doing that. But the economy, fellas. Let's start off with the economy, because before we got in here tonight, we were kind of just going back and forth about the economy and all these jobs now. People just sitting home just waiting to go back to work. But in the meantime, bills are piling up. Things are not stopping. Kids are eating up everything. The economy's still moving,
happening?
For certain people.
What's happening?
What do you see happening now, man? Because we want to definitely give the people every week an update on, because you guys are financial guys, and you give them a forecast of what you see about to happen in the next 6 weeks here in the United States of America, man. What do you brothers think?
You want to go, Constance?
Yeah, go ahead there. Go ahead.
Man, I see the United States economy starting to take off, man. I really do. I think we're gonna get going back again. If you look to see, we're a juggernaut. We find a way. You know what I'm saying? We found a way, and that's what we did, man. We found a way. You see people, there's distilleries here that used to make beer. They now are turning themselves to making hand sanitizer. We got, halfway houses, man, making masks. we mobilize them, man. So that's what we do. And like I said, it's a lot of opportunities, man. Right now, if you know somebody that got a sewing machine, you can sell masks. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, man.
Yeah. It's the opportunity is really endless. There's so many things that you could take advantage of with financial fallouts like this. It's all about supply and demand, and like to generalize what Darren is talking about, there's going to be needs in certain places. So
what's up, Uppity Unicorn? I just saw you in here. What's
and
up,
in 2020, social media is a direct indicator of what a trend is, and you just you scour those trends and you supply the demand with those trends create. And with internet,
what up, man?
That is so prevalent in our lives.
Yo, what's going on?
We have means to go into direct free market capitalism and be able to make money directly and independently. And if you're smart enough, with a lot of tax protection. A lot of tax protection.
Definitely. I was looking at it was a meme that went around the other day. It said startups founded during the last Great Recession between 2008 and 2010, and Uber, Airbnb, Slack, Pinterest, WhatsApp, Square, Vimo. I love it that you guys are thinking along those lines, because it's like, yo, how can we benefit? What opportunities lie in what's going on? We can't go with the whole narrative and it be doom and gloom. So I can remember, back in the early 2000s, the world was supposed to end. And it almost seemed like people wanted to discourage you from not getting about your money, getting about your finances and everything, and just saying, you know what, the world's going to end, let me just stop.
Right.
So, brothers, what can we do practically right now to take advantage of what we got going on in the economy? Because Darren said it's like 30-something million jobs. People just stop working right now. What can we do right now? What can the average person do listening right now? What advice would you give them?
Now's the time, man. The government is giving you money to start up capital, man. They're giving you money to start a business, man. They're financing your startup. So if they're doing, with this $2 trillion, man, they're adding money for unemployment insurance. So that means you can start a business, get your business together, and you got somebody paying you. So you got money that's being paid. It's being there while you putting your whole business plan together and getting ready to launch your stuff, man. You getting the stimulus money, the $3,400 if you have a family. But one, you get the unemployment insurance. There was unemployment claims that went up, so you get unemployment insurance. That's money. That's now you got money coming in your pocket. Now you got something you can go start a business with. They telling you that they're giving you up to I think to September. If you have student loans, there's no student loan payments. There's no mortgage payments for federally backed mortgages. And that's like 97% of all mortgages out there. So you don't have to make a mortgage payment. A lot of people don't have to pay rent. So you don't have to pay rent. You have to pay mortgage. You got money coming in. You a fool if you can't make it happen, man. You can't make it happen for real. Right on, up there, right on.
You know what? And I've been this way for at least the last 15 years. It's just that this economy is finally catching up with, the kind of attitudes that me and Darren
I saw that RC this morning, man.
It's absolutely no excuse. It's I would only be reiterating what Darren is already saying, but in this day and time, there's absolutely no excuse except your own ego getting in the way of supplying what's needed. I mean, the internet is digital real estate is survival. There is no option. There is no gray area. And so now people are starting to realize that you cannot depend on a paycheck from Friday to Friday. You're not going to be able to depend on that anymore. And you got to diversify your ability to allocate funds. And with the internet, if you have an internet-based company, let me break that down to the least common denominator. You want an internet-based means of commerce because you're speaking to the entire world in seconds. In seconds, you're speaking to the entire world. Not just to somebody you hope is going to buy your product, but you're going to directly market to the people that want what you got regardless. So the playing field is even. Competition is changing the world of economy because of the internet. Competition is one of the aspects of of economy, along with the term that we call complexity. So now you're able to promote. You want competitors because now you can create a genre and build on that genre and create a niche market in seconds. In seconds, under $1,000. So you can do it. It can get done, and now's the best time to do it.
Fellas, I want to ask. Are we off? Are we good? Yeah. I want to ask this, fellas. We see a lot of people losing their jobs or now relying on unemployment. Unemployment rate is at an all-time high. They hitting these unemployment offices.
All right,
They're
Consul,
online
man.
like a mug. Every state.
All right, man. What's going on, Consul, man? How you doing?
Oh yeah, sorry about that, man. My mic was muted. Yeah, I'm doing good, man. 3 a.m. almost.
There you
Doing
go.
pretty good.
That's what's happening, man. That's what's happening. So, yeah, I want to play a little bit of that, man. And now I want to play some of this Black Rednecks thing, man. That's a really good book. So let's see if we got some people that want to hang around for Black Rednecks or not. I don't know. We shall see what we shall see, and we shall find what we shall find.
It's my shiznit right here.
All right, man. Let's go.
It's become archaic. And
Start from the beginning.
Blackstone Audiobooks presents Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. Preface. Race and rhetoric have gone together for so long that it is easy to forget that facts also matter. And these facts often contradict many widely held beliefs. Fantasies and fallacies about racial and ethnic issues have had a particularly painful and deadly history, so exposing some of them is more than an academic exercise. The history of intergroup strife has been written in blood in many countries around the world and across centuries of human history. The purpose of this book is to expose some of the more blatant misconceptions poisoning race relations in our time. The reasons for these misconceptions range from simple, innocent ignorance to reasons that are far from simple and far from innocent. Many of the facts cited here may be surprising or even startling to some readers, but they are not literally unknown to scholars. They have simply not been widely discussed in the media or even in academia. Too much has been assumed for too long, and too little has been scrutinized. It may be optimistic merely to suggest that racial or ethnic issues can be discussed rationally. Evidence to the contrary is all too abundant in the strident and sweeping condemnations directed against many who have tried to do so. Yet there is also evidence in recent years of a growing willingness to consider views that differ from the racial orthodoxy that has prevailed largely unchallenged from the 1960s onward in intellectual circles and in the popular media. In any event, these essays summarize the conclusions of more than a quarter of a century of my research on racial and cultural issues, as well as drawing on the work of innumerable other scholars around the world. These writings do not pretend to be definitive. If they provoke thoughts on a subject where cliches and dogmas too often prevail, then this book will have achieved one of its major goals. However, even a work seeking primarily to untangle a complex set of historic social issues can provoke the fashionable question, but what is your solution? Yet, there is not the slightest danger that there will be a shortage of solutions. On the contrary, an abundance of uninformed solutions has been one of our biggest social problems. Any serious consideration of social problems is likely to involve trade-offs rather than neat solutions. And trade-offs depend on values which can vary from one individual to the next. What trade-offs others might make after considering what these essays have to offer is not something that can be predicted, nor is such a prediction necessary. There is still much to be said for the ancient adage, with all you're getting, get understanding. If this book can contribute to understanding on a subject where misunderstandings abound, then it will have done its work. Because this book is written for the general public, it does not feature long, convoluted sentences with escape clauses designed to prevent words from being twisted to mean something that they were never intended to mean. Common sense can be more readily expected when writing for the general public than when writing for the intelligentsia. To prevent the words in the essays that follow from being stretched, twisted, or given clever meanings, let me state here and now that these essays do not mean that 1. All Southern whites were or are rednecks. That 2. All Black Americans today or in the past were or are Black rednecks. That 3. Jews are exactly the same as the other groups with whom they are compared. Or that 4. Slavery is somehow morally acceptable because everyone was guilty of it. One cannot predict, much less forestall, all the clever misinterpretations that others might put on one's words. The most that can be done is to alert honest people to the problem. While this book is not particularly large in bulk,
What's up,
its
Northern Cal?
scope is worldwide, and it goes back through centuries. No one can write a book of such scope without incurring many debts to others. These include scholars who devoted much of their careers to the study of some particular specialty, such as the history of agriculture in the southern United States or the origins in Britain of various social groups in America. Such debts are too numerous to list here, quite aside from the danger of implicating other writers in conclusions which are my own. What must be acknowledged is my debt to the Hoover Institution, which has provided the conditions and the support which have facilitated my research and writing for more than 2 decades. For much of that time, my research assistant, Na Leo, has been an indispensable part of my work, and for this particular book, she has been very ably assisted by the dedicated work of Elizabeth Costa. In the end, however, I must and will take full responsibility for the conclusions reached in the essays that follow. Thomas Sowell, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Black rednecks and white liberals. These people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job, they flout the law constantly and neglect their children, they drink too much, and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. For some reason or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life. This was said in 1956 in Indianapolis, not about blacks or other minorities, but about poor whites from the South. Nor was Indianapolis unique in this respect. A 1951 survey in Detroit found that white Southerners living there were considered undesirable by 21% of those surveyed, compared to 13% who ranked blacks the same way. In the late 1940s, a Chicago employer said frankly, "I told the guard at the plant gate to tell the hillbillies that there were no openings." When poor whites from the South moved into northern cities to work in war plants during the Second World War, occasionally a white Southerner would find that a flat or a furnished room had just been rented when the landlord heard his Southern accent. More is involved here than a mere parallel between blacks and Southern whites. What is involved is a common subculture that goes back for centuries, which has encompassed everything from ways of talking to attitudes toward education, violence, and sex, and which originated not in the South, but in those parts of the British Isles from which white Southerners came. That culture long ago died out where it originated in Britain, while surviving in the American South. Then it largely died out among both white and black Southerners, while still surviving today in the poorest and worst of the urban black ghettos. It is not uncommon for a culture to survive longer where it is transplanted and to retain characteristics lost in its place of origin. The French spoken in Quebec and the Spanish spoken in Mexico contain words and phrases that have long since become archaic in France and Spain. Regional German dialects persisted among Germans living in the United States after those dialects had begun to die out in Germany itself. A scholar specializing in the history of the South has likewise noted among white Southerners archaic word forms, while another scholar has pointed out the continued use in that region of terms that were familiar at the time of the first Queen Elizabeth. The card game whist is today played almost exclusively by blacks, especially low-income blacks, though in the 18th century it was played by the British upper classes and has since then evolved into bridge. The history of the evolution of this game is indicative of a much broader pattern of cultural evolution in much more weighty things. Southern whites not only spoke the English language in very different ways from whites in other regions. Their churches, their roads, their homes, their music, their education, their food, and their sex lives were all sharply different from those of other whites. The history of this redneck or cracker culture is more than a curiosity. It has contemporary significance because of its influence on the economic and social evolution of vast numbers of people, millions of blacks and whites, and its continuing influence on the lives and deaths of a residual population in America's black ghettos, which has still not completely escaped from that culture. From early in American history, foreign visitors and domestic travelers alike were struck by cultural contrasts between the white population of the South and that of the rest of the country in general, and of New England in particular. In the early 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville contrasted white Southerners with white Northerners in his classic Democracy in America, and Frederick Law Olmsted did the same later in his books about his travels through the antebellum South, notably Cotton Kingdom. De Tocqueville set a pattern when he concluded that almost all the differences which may be noticed between the Americans in the southern and in the northern states have originated in slavery. Olmsted likewise attributed the differences between white Southerners and white Northerners to the existence of slavery in the South. So did widely read antebellum Southern writer Hinton Helper, who declared that slavery, and nothing but slavery, has retarded the progress and prosperity of our portion of the Union. Just as they explained regional differences between whites by slavery, so many others in a later era would explain differences between blacks and whites nationwide by slavery. Plausible as these explanations may seem in both cases, they will not stand up under a closer scrutiny of history. It is perhaps understandable that the great overwhelming moral curse of slavery has presented a tempting causal explanation of the peculiar subculture of Southern whites, as well as that of blacks. Yet this same subculture had existed among Southern whites and their ancestors in those parts of the British Isles from which they came, long before they had ever seen a black slave. The nature of this subculture, among people who were called rednecks and crackers in Britain before they ever saw America, needs to be explored before turning to the question of its current status among ghetto blacks and how developments in the larger society have affected its evolution. Redneck culture. Emigration from Britain, like other migrations around the world, was not random in either its origins or its destinations. Most of the Britons who migrated to colonial Massachusetts, for example, came from within a 60-mile radius of the town of Haverhill in East Anglia. The Virginia aristocracy came from different localities in southern and western England. Most of the common white people of the South came from the northern borderlands of England. For centuries, a no-man's land between Scotland and England, as well as from the Scottish Highlands and from Ulster County, Ireland. All these fringe areas were turbulent, if not lawless, regions, where none of the contending forces was able to establish full control and create a stable order. Whether called a Celtic fringe or North Britons, these were people from outside the cultural heartland of England, as their behavior on both sides of the Atlantic showed. Before the era of modern transportation and communication, sharp regional differences were both common and persistent. In some of the counties of colonial Virginia, from nearly 3/4 to 4/5 of the people came from northern Britain, and similar proportions were found in some of the counties of Kentucky and Tennessee, as well as in parts of both the Carolinas. Although they predominated in many parts of the South, such people also had some northern enclaves in colonial America, notably western Pennsylvania, where Ulster
Start to see
Scots
his
settled.
correlation, man.
What is at least equally important as where particular people settled is when they emigrated from the borderlands, Ulster, and the Scottish Highlands. Scotland in particular progressed enormously in the 18th century. The level from which it began may be indicated by the fact that a visitor to late 18th century Edinburgh found it noteworthy that its residents no longer threw sewage from their chamber pots out their windows into the street, something that passers-by had long had to be alert for to avoid being splattered. Such crude
Man,
and
I might kill
unsanitary
somebody, man.
living
I
had
feel like that
long
happened to
been
me, man.
characteristic of earlier times, when rural Scots lived in the same primitive shelters with their animals, and vermin abounded.
You hear that, man? It's crazy, man.
A similar lack of concern with cleanliness was found among others in the borderlands of Britain, and among their descendants on the other side of the Atlantic in the antebellum South. For example, a 19th century politician built up a political machine in the poor white districts of Mississippi by such practices as this. He did not resort to any conventional tactics of kissing dirty babies, but he pleased mothers and fathers in log cabins by taking their children upon his lap and searching for red bugs, lice, and other vermin. Back in the British Isles, the life of the Scottish people was transformed dramatically from the masses to the elites as they advanced from being one of the least educated to one of the most educated peoples in Europe. However, what is significant here is that much of the migration to the American South occurred before these sweeping social transformations. This timing was crucial, as Professor Grady McWhiney has pointed out in his book, Cracker Culture. Had the South been peopled by 19th century Scots, Welshmen, and Ulstermen, the course of Southern history would doubtless have been radically different. 19th century Scottish and Scotch-Irish immigrants did in fact fit quite comfortably into Northern American society. Significantly, the Irish, who retained their Celtic ways, did not. But only a trickle of the flood of 19th century immigrants came into the South. The ancestors of the vast majority of Southerners arrived in America before the Anglicization of Scotland, Wales, and Ulster had advanced very far. In earlier centuries, Scotland was a poor and backward country, like Wales and Ireland, and like the turbulent northern borderlands of England, where the Scots and the English fought wars and committed atrocities against each other for centuries. Local feuding clans and freebooting marauders kept this region in an uproar, even when there were no military hostilities between the English and Scottish kingdoms. Ulster County had a different kind of turbulence, as the English and Scottish settlers there encountered the hostility and terrorist activities of the conquered, dispossessed, and embittered indigenous Irish population. These were the parts of Britain from which most people migrated to the American South, before the political and cultural unification of the British Isles or the standardization of the English language. The rednecks of these regions were what one social historian has called some of the most disorderly inhabitants of a deeply disordered land. In this world of impotent laws, daily dangers, and lives that could be snuffed out at any moment, the snatching at whatever fleeting pleasures presented themselves was at least understandable.
Wow, man. Doesn't that sounds familiar, right? With a bunch of people that I know. 3-5-4 figure. All right, y'all. Keep going.
Certainly prudence and long-range planning of one's life had no such payoff in this chaotic world as in more settled and orderly societies under the protection of effective laws. Books, businesses, technology, and science were not the kinds of things likely to be promoted or admired in the world of the rednecks and crackers. Manliness and the forceful projection of that manliness to others, and advertising of one's willingness to fight and even to put one's life on the line, were at least plausible means of gaining whatever measure of security was possible in a lawless region and a violent time. The kinds of attitudes and cultural values produced by centuries of living under such conditions did not disappear very quickly, even when social evolution in North America slowly and almost imperceptibly created a new and different world with different objective prospects. What the rednecks, or crackers, brought with them across the ocean was a whole constellation of attitudes, values, and behavior patterns that might have made sense in the world in which they had lived for centuries, but which would prove to be counterproductive in the world to which they were going, and counterproductive to the blacks who would live in their midst for centuries before emerging into freedom and migrating to the great urban centers of the United States, taking with them similar values. The cultural values and social patterns prevalent among Southern whites included an aversion to work, proneness to violence, neglect of education, sexual promiscuity, improvidence, drunkenness, lack of entrepreneurship, reckless searches for excitement, lively music and dance, and a style of
Whoa. You hear that, Kansu?
Man.
Whoa. Whoa.
Damn.
I mean, wow, man. What can you say, man?
This is why this is one of my favorite books, man.
Yeah. Let's keep rolling, man. Let's keep rolling.
Religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric, unbridled emotions, and flamboyant imagery. This oratorical style carried over into the political oratory of the region in both the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, and has continued on into our own times among Black politicians, preachers, and activists. Touchy pride, vanity, and boastful self-dramatization were also part of this redneck culture among people from regions of Britain where the civilization was the least developed. They boast and lack self-restraint, Olmsted said, after observing their descendants in the American antebellum South. While Professor Grady McWhiney's Cracker Culture is perhaps the most thorough historical study of the values and behavioral patterns of white Southerners, many other scholarly studies have turned up very similar patterns, even when they differed in some ways as to the causes. Professor David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed, for example, challenges the Celtic connection thesis put forth by Professor McWhiney, but shows many of the same cultural patterns among the same people, both in Britain and in the American South. Popular writings of the 19th and 20th centuries have likewise described similar behavior, including the Indianapolis residents' comments on white Southern migrants to that city, which sounds so much like what many have said about ghetto blacks. None of this is meant to claim that these patterns have remained rigidly unchanged over the centuries, or that there are literally no differences between whites and blacks in any aspects of this subculture. However, what is remarkable is how pervasive and how close the similarities have been. Pride and violence. Centuries before Black Pride became a fashionable phrase, there was Cracker Pride, and it was very much the same kind of pride. It was not pride in any particular achievement or set of behavioral standards or moral principles adhered to. It was instead a touchiness about anything that might be even remotely construed as a personal slight, much less an insult, combined with a willingness to erupt into violence over it. New Englanders were baffled about this kind of pride among crackers. Observing such people, the Yankees could not understand what they had to feel proud about. However, this kind of pride is perhaps best illustrated by an episode reported in Professor McWhiney's Cracker Culture. When an Englishman, tired of waiting for a Southerner to start working on a house he had contracted to build, hired another man to do the job, the enraged Southerner, who considered himself dishonored, vowed, "Tomorrow morn I will come with men and 20 rifles, and I will have your life, or you shall have mine." In the vernacular of our later times,
What the hell?
he had been dissed, and he was not going to stand for it, regardless of the consequences for himself or others. The history of the antebellum South is full of episodes showing the same pattern, whether expressed in the highly formalized duels of the aristocracy or in the no-holds-barred style of fighting called rough and tumble among the common folk, a style that included biting off ears and gouging out eyes. It was not simply that particular isolated individuals did such things. Social approval was given to these practices, as illustrated by this episode in the antebellum South. A crowd gathered and arranged itself in an impromptu ring. The contestants were asked if they wished to fight fair or rough and tumble. When they chose rough and tumble, a roar of approval rose from the multitude. This particular fight ended with the loser's nose bitten off, his ears torn off, and both his eyes gouged out, after which the victor himself, maimed and bleeding, was chaired round the grounds to the cheers of the crowd.
Wow.
This rough and tumble style of fighting was also popular in the southern highlands of Scotland, where grabbing an opponent's testicles and attempting to castrate him by hand was also an accepted practice.
Wow.
Scottish Highlanders were, in centuries past, part of the Celtic fringe, or North Britons, outside the orbit of English culture, not only as it existed in England, but also in the Scottish lowlands. The Highlanders lagged far behind the Lowlanders in education and economic progress, as well as in the speaking of the English language, for Gaelic was still widely spoken by Highlanders in the 19th century,
I know
not
some
only
people
in
from
Scotland
Wales, man.
itself,
Yeah.
but also in North Carolina and in Australia,
Look at
where
that, man.
immigrants from the Scottish Highlands were unable to communicate with English-speaking people, including Lowland Scots who had also immigrated. In the Hebrides Islands off Scotland, Gaelic had still not completely died out in the middle of the 20th century. What is important in the pride and violence patterns among rednecks and crackers was not that particular people did particular things at particular times and places, nor is it necessary to attempt to quantify such behavior. What is crucial is that violence growing out of such pride had social approval. As Professor McWhiney pointed out, men often killed and went free in the South, just as in earlier times they had in Ireland and Scotland. As one observer in the South noted, enemies would meet, exchange insults, and one would shoot the other down, professing that he had acted in self-defense because he believed the victim was armed. When such a story was told in court, in a community where it is not a strange thing for men to carry about their persons deadly weapons, each member of the jury feels that he would have done the same thing under similar circumstances, so that in condemning him, they would but condemn themselves. The actions of Southern courts often amazed outsiders, Professor McWhiney said. But what may be even more revealing of widespread attitudes were the cases that never even went to trial. As another study of white Southerners put it, to many rural Southerners, rather than a set of legal statutes, justice remained a matter of societal norms allowing for respect of property rights, individual honor, and a maximum of personal independence. Any violation of this pattern amounted to a breach of justice requiring a specific response from the injured party. Upon learning that a youthful neighbor had approached his wife in an overly friendly manner, Robert Leard of Tangipahoa, Louisiana, promptly tracked the young man down and killed him. Under the Piney Woods Code of Justice, anything less would have invited shame and ridicule upon the Leard family. Intensity of personal pride was connected by Olmsted with the fiend-like street fights of the South. He mentioned an episode of public murder with impunity. A gentleman of veracity, now living in the South, told me that among his friends he had once numbered 2 young men who were themselves intimate friends, till one of them, taking offense at some foolish words uttered by the other, challenges him. A large crowd assembled to see the duel, which took place on a piece of prairie ground. The combatants came armed with rifles, and at the first interchange of shots, the challenged man fell disabled by a ball in the thigh. The other, throwing down his rifle, walked toward him, and kneeling by his side, drew a bowie knife and deliberately butchered him. The crowd of bystanders not only permitted this, but the execrable assassin still lives in the community, has since married, and, as far as my informant could judge, his social position has been rather advanced than otherwise, from thus dealing with his enemy. Again, what is important here is not the isolated incident itself, but the set of social attitudes which allowed such incidents to take place publicly with impunity. The killer knowing in advance that what he was doing had community approval. Moreover, such attitudes went back for centuries on both sides of the Atlantic, at least among the particular people concerned. During the era when dueling became a pattern among upper-class Americans, between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, it was particularly prevalent in the South. As a social history of the United States noted, of Southern statesmen who rose to prominence after 1790, hardly one can be mentioned who was not involved in a duel. Editors of Southern newspapers became involved in duels so often that cartoonists depicted them with a pen in one hand and a dueling pistol in the other. Most duels arose not over substantive issues, but over words considered insulting. At lower social levels, Southern feuds such as that between the Hatfields and the McCoys, which began in a dispute over a pig and ultimately claimed more than 20 lives, became legendary. It has been estimated that, while at least 3/4 of the settlers in colonial New England originated in the lowland southeastern half of Britain, a similarly large proportion of the population of the South originated in the Scottish Highlands, Ireland, Wales, or the northern and western uplands of England. Those arriving from Ireland in colonial times would have been from Ulster County, where Scots and Englishmen settled, since substantial immigration of the indigenous Irish did not begin until near the middle of the 19th century. Radically different cultures could develop and persist during this era before transportation and communication developed to the point of promoting widespread interactions among people in different regions. In colonial America, the people of the English borderlands and of the Celtic fringe were seen by contemporaries as culturally quite distinct and were socially unwelcome. Mob action prevented a shipload of Ulster Scots from landing in Boston in 1719, and the Quaker leaders of eastern Pennsylvania encouraged Ulster Scots to settle out in western Pennsylvania, where they acted as a buffer to the Indians, as well as being a constant source of friction and conflict with the Indians. It was not just in the North that crackers and rednecks were considered to be undesirables. Southern plantation owners with poor whites living on adjoining land would often offer to buy their land for more than it was worth in order to be rid of such neighbors. Because there were no racial differences to form separate statistical categories for these North Britons and for other whites who settled in the South, or in particular enclaves elsewhere, indirect indicators must serve as proxies for these cultural differences. Names are among these indicators. Edward, for example, was a popular name in Virginia and in Wessex, England, from which many Virginians had emigrated. But the first 40 classes of undergraduates at Harvard College contained only one man named Edward. It would be nearly 2 centuries before Harvard enrolled anyone named Patrick, even though that was a common name in western Pennsylvania, where the Ulster Scots settled. This says something not only about the social and geographic differences of the times, but also about how regionalized the naming patterns were then, in contrast to the fact that no one today finds it particularly strange when an Asian American has such non-Asian first names as Kevin or Michelle. Even where there was no conflict or hostility involved, Southerners often showed a reckless disregard for human life, including their own. For example, the racing of steamboats that happened to encounter each other on the rivers of the South often ended with exploding boilers, especially when the excited competition led to the tying down of safety valves in order to build up more pressure to generate more speed. An impromptu race between steamboats that encountered each other in the Mississippi illustrates the pattern.
Bananas.
On board one boat was an old lady who, having bought a winter stock of bacon, pork, etc., was returning to her home on the banks of the Mississippi. Fun lovers on board both boats insisted upon a race. Cheers and drawn pistols obliged the captains to cooperate. As the boats struggled to outdistance each other, excited passengers demanded more speed. Despite every effort, the boats raced evenly until the old lady directed her slaves to throw all her casks of bacon into the boilers. Her boat then moved ahead of the other vessel, which suddenly exploded. Clouds of splinters and human limbs darkened the sky. On the undamaged boat, passengers shouted their victory, but above their cheers could be heard the shrill voice of the old lady crying, "I did it! I did it! It's all my bacon!" On the Mississippi and other western rivers of the United States, as it existed in the early 19th century, it has been estimated that 30% of all the steamboats were lost in accidents. Part of this may have been due to deficiencies in the early steamboats themselves, but much of it was due to the recklessness with which they were operated on southern rivers. The comments of a fireman on a Mississippi steamboat of that era may suggest why a river voyage was considered more dangerous than crossing the Atlantic, at a time when sinkings in the Atlantic were by no means rare. Talk about northern steamers, the fireman of a Mississippi steamboat sneered to an Eastern traveler in 1844. "It don't need no spunk to navigate them waters. You ain't bust a boiler in 5 years. But I tell you, stranger, it takes a man to ride one of these half-alligator boats, head on a snag, high pressures, valve soldered down, 600 souls on board, and in danger of going to the devil." This was no mere idle talk. Among the steamboat explosions in the South, one on the Mississippi in 1838 killed well over 100 people, and another near Baton Rouge in 1859 killed more than half of the 400 people on board and badly injured more than half the survivors. Southerners were just as reckless on land, Whether in escapades undertaken for the excitement of the moment, or in the many fights and deaths resulting from some insult or slight among people touchy about their honor and dignity. Again, all of this went back to a way of life in the turbulent regions of Britain from which white Southerners came. Nor is it hard to recognize in these attitudes clear parallels to the behavior and attitudes of ghetto gangs today, who kill over a look or a word or any action that can be construed as dissing them. Pride had yet another side to it. Among the definitions of a cracker in the Oxford Dictionary is a braggart, one who talks trash in today's vernacular. A wisecracker. More than mere wisecracks were involved, however. The pattern is one said by Professor McWhiney to go back to descriptions of ancient Celts as boasters and threateners, and given to bombastic self-dramatization. Examples today come readily to mind, not only from ghetto life and gangsta rap, but also from militant black leaders, spokesmen, or activists. What is painfully ironic is that such attitudes and behavior are projected today as aspects of a distinctive black identity, when in fact, they are part of a centuries-old pattern among the whites in whose midst generations of blacks lived in the South. Any broad-brush discussion of cultural patterns must, of course, not claim that all people, whether white or black, had the same culture, much less to the same degree. There are not only changes over time, there are cross-currents at any given time. Nevertheless, it is useful to see the outlines of a general pattern, even when that pattern erodes over time and at varying rates among different subgroups. The violence for which white Southerners became most lastingly notorious was lynching. Like other aspects of the redneck and cracker culture, it has often been attributed to race or slavery. In fact, however, most lynching victims in the antebellum South were white. Economic considerations alone would prevent a slave owner from lynching his own slave or tolerating anyone else's doing so. It was only after the Civil War that the emancipated blacks became the principal targets of lynching. But by then, Southern vigilante violence had been a tradition for more than a century in North America, and even longer back in the regions of Britain from which crackers and rednecks came, where retributive justice was often left in private hands. Even the burning cross of the Ku Klux Klan has been traced back to the fiery cross of Old Scotland, used by feuding clans. Economic activity. Observers of the white population of the antebellum South often commented not only on their poverty, but also on their lack of industriousness or entrepreneurship. A contemporary characterized many white Southerners as too poor to keep slaves and too proud to work. A landmark history of agriculture in the antebellum South described the poor whites this way. They cultivated in a casual and careless fashion small patches of corn or rice, sweet potatoes, cowpeas, and garden products. Women and children did a large part of the work. The men spent their time principally in hunting or idleness. The men were inveterate drunkards, and sometimes the women joined them in drinking inferior whiskey. Licentiousness was prevalent among them. Among their equals, the men were quarrelsome and inclined to crimes of violence. The poor whites were densely ignorant. Their labors tended to be intermittent, often when they were pressed for money rather than a steady employment career. Frederick Law Olmsted called it lazy poverty, with whatever work they did being done in a thoughtless manner. Summarizing his observations in the antebellum South, Olmsted said, "I know that while men seldom want an abundance of coarse food in the cotton states, the proportion of the free white men who live as well in any aspect as our working classes in the North, on an average, is small, and that the citizens of the cotton states, as a whole, are poor. They work little, and that little, badly. They earn little, they sell little, they buy little, and they have little, very little, of the common comforts and consolations of civilized life. Their destitution is not material only, it is intellectual, and it is moral." When Olmsted found work done efficiently, promptly, and well during his travels through the South, when he found well-run businesses, good libraries, impressive churches, and efficiently functioning institutions in general, He almost invariably found them to be run by Northerners, foreigners, or Jews. Nor was he the only visiting observer to reach such conclusions. Another observed that nearly all of the Old South's successful storekeepers were either Yankees or Yankee-trained Southerners. A French visitor said that when you saw a plantation in better condition than others, you would often discover that it was owned by someone from the North. A history of Southern agriculture presented this picture of North Carolina in the early 18th century. Many of the inhabitants were rough borderers who lived a crude, half-savage existence. Some were herdsmen, dependent mainly on the product of the range and under the necessity of eating meat without bread. There were also many thriftless and lazy families who had been attracted to the country by the mild climate and the ease with which a bare livelihood could be obtained by hunting and fishing, raising a little corn and keeping a few head of swine, and possibly a cow or two on the range. On the other hand, there were small farmers, many of Northern or European extraction, living industrious and thrifty lives amidst a rude abundance and considerable diversity of food supplies. They maintained good-sized herds of cattle, swine, and sheep, and the women made butter and cheese. Borderers, at that point, would refer to people from the borderlands of Britain, those included in what Professor McWhiney and others have called the Celtic Fringe, and what Professor Fisher called North Britons. While the making of butter and cheese might seem to be an unremarkable activity in most rural communities, butter and cheese making by these farmers of non-Southerner origins was in fact exceptional in the South. One of Frederick Law Olmsted's complaints during his travels through the antebellum South was the scarcity of butter, despite all the cows he saw. Even among plantation owners, he said, as for butter, some have heard of it, some have seen it, but few have eaten it.
Wow.
Hard data support his conclusions about the scarcity of butter in the antebellum South, despite an abundance of cows. In 1860, the South had 40% of all the dairy cows in the country, but produced just 20% of the butter and only 1% of the cheese.
Wow.
As a study of antebellum Southern agriculture noted, attempts to stimulate greater attention to commercial production were futile, and even the bluegrass regions imported a large proportion of the cheese consumed. The study concluded, in short, while the South abounded in cattle, the reported production of dairy products was very small. A table based on census statistics shows that some of the southern states, such as Texas and Florida, had far more cattle per capita than important dairy states like Vermont and New York. And in most of the southern states, cattle per capita were nearly or quite as numerous as in the northern states. Yet the production of butter and cheese per capita in most of the southern states was insignificant as compared with per capita production in the principal northeastern states.
I want to stop for a second. Man, and do a quick kind of once over the book. What do y'all think so far, man? What you heard? Let's see, kind of
powerful information too, man.
Yeah, I mean, he's dropping dimes, man. You know, he's pointing out the correlation, man, between blacks, ghetto blacks, man, and you see the behavior where the behavior was adopted from, man.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So right now, it's that black folks are truly, adopted the redneck culture, the cracker culture, man.
That's right. It wasn't our culture.
Nah, man. It really is like, you're looking like a cracker, man.
Exactly.
Wow. I'm you know what I'm saying? Wow, man. What do y'all think, man? He says you have to review the book. The half has never been told. It speaks on the capitalism and slavery like this. I'm not sure. I kind of think I know what that means. But doing this, say you stop drinking Corona because of the virus. He says he drinks 6 Corona a day. Wow. All right, y'all. Let's start it back up, man.
A speaker before an agricultural society in Orange County, North Carolina said, "It is a reproach to us as farmers, and no little deduction from our wealth, that we suffer the population of our towns and villages to supply themselves with butter from another Orange County in New York."
Which is crazy.
In colonial times, butter was imported from as far away as Ireland. Where butter was not imported, it was often produced locally by people of non-Southern origins.
That's crazy.
As a scholarly history of Southern agriculture reported, in 1858, the dairies producing whole milk for the city of Louisville, Kentucky, were described as probably as well conducted as any in the country, but almost without exception, managed by Swiss or German operatives.
Wow.
Meanwhile, a newspaper in South Carolina said in 1857, "Good butter is indeed a luxury to almost every planter in the southern country,
And they had
and there is
slaves.
perhaps no one article of food that is more eagerly sought after."
And they had
In
slaves, man.
antebellum Virginia, a Richmond newspaper likewise complained of the scarcity of good butter, saying that the quality of butter available in the local market would hardly be thought good enough to grease a cartwheel.
Wow.
When considering legislation to try to remedy the situation, a member of the Virginia legislature attributed the poor quality of that state's butter to the carelessness with which Virginia farmers prepared it. One reason for the contrast between the abundance of butter and cheese produced by German farmers in states like Wisconsin, for example, and the scarcity of butter and cheese in the South was that German farmers, wherever they were located, tended to build fences and huge barns for their livestock and to feed them there during the winter. Southerners more often let their cows and hogs roam freely during the winter, even though this meant that in the spring they turned up half-starved and it took the summer for them to put on normal weight. This, too, was a continuation of patterns found among their ancestors in the British Isles, and was part of a more general pattern of carelessness. Many other observers noticed the broken fences in the...
That's why you got razorbacks, man. You know that, right? All them wild pigs, call them razorbacks. It's because of that, man. They let the pigs out there, man. Let the pigs run wild. They break free. And now it's like a serious problem. You know, they've been there for years and years. It's just herds and herds of wild pigs, man. Crazy, man.
Stunted cattle running at large, unfed and unprotected. Their manure was put to no use. Artificial pasture long remained a rarity, and few farmers stored feed for the winter. In Virginia, a French traveler of the late 17th century saw poor beasts of a morning all covered with snow and trembling with the cold, but no forage was provided for them. They eat the bark of the trees because the grass was covered. Wild animals, wolves, bears, and savage dogs attacked the helpless cattle and made the raising of sheep difficult. Germans were better able than Southerners to milk their cows regularly and prepare dairy products, while cows owned by Southerners were more likely to run dry after calves were weaned. A contemporary observer said that even Southern farmers with many cows will not give themselves the trouble of milking more than will maintain their family. As late as the 1930s, a scholar studying the geography and economy of the South wrote, "The close attention to duty, the habits of steady, skillful routine accepted by butterfat producers of Wisconsin as a matter of fact, are traits not yet present in Southern culture." At that point, the Southern states, with 26% of the country's dairy cows, produced just 7% of processed dairy products such as butter, cheese, ice cream, and condensed milk. There was a similar contrast between German farmers and Southern farmers when it came to clearing land for farming back in pioneering days. Germans cleared frontier land by both chopping down trees and laboriously removing their stumps and roots, so that all the land could be plowed thereafter. Southerners more often cut down the tree, or even simply girdled it and left it to die and rot, but in any case, leaving the stump in the ground and plowing around it. Although the erosion-prone soils of the southern uplands have been blamed for the poverty of the whites living on them, nevertheless, on that same land, Germans were able to cultivate the hill soil so as to avoid erosion, and were willing to expend upon it the additional labor which its topography required, so that these soils in their hands yielded excellent regular returns. Comments on the lack of enterprise by Southern whites were made by numerous observers in various parts of the South. In Alexis de Tocqueville's classic Democracy in America, he contrasted the attitudes toward work among Southern and Northern whites as being so great as to be visible to the casual observer sailing down the Ohio River and comparing the Ohio side with the Kentucky side. These were not just the prejudices of outsiders. No Southern man, South Carolina's famed Senator John C. Calhoun said, "Not even the poorest or the lowest will, under any circumstances, perform menial labor. He has too much pride for that." General Robert E. Lee likewise declared, "Our people are opposed to work. Our troops, officers, community, and press all ridicule and resist it." Many whites, according to a leading Southern historian, were disposed to leave good enough alone and put off changes till the morrow. Very similar kinds of comments were made about these Southerners' ancestors in the parts of the British Isles from which they came. Although the term lazy appears frequently in comments on these people on both sides of the Atlantic, there has been no evidence of any such aversion on their part to strenuous physical activity in dancing, fighting, hunting, and other recreational activities, so sloth was not the real issue. Nor have rednecks or crackers been prominent in such less physically demanding activities as entrepreneurship or scholarship. It is the nature of the particular activities in which they have taken an active interest and on which they have expended their energies, rather than the physical demands of those activities, that seems to have been crucial. Not only did many of the groups who settled in the South disdain business as a career, as their ancestors had in those parts of Britain from which they came, they typically lacked the kinds of habits necessary to be successful in business. Among the habits needed to run a business, none is more basic than a steady application to the tasks at hand, doing things in a business-like way. But those relatively few Southerners who did run businesses often displayed no such business-like attitudes. Even when there was business to transact, Southerners would often stop to go watch a cockfight or a parade, or visit a saloon or go hunting. In traveling in the South, a Northern visitor commented in the 1850s, "You become astonished at the little attention men pay to their business." Such views were not confined to Northerners, however, nor to urban businesses. According to a noted history of the antebellum South, the Richmond Enquirer attributed the success of Northern farmers where Southerners had failed to the social nature of the latter, which led them to gather round the courthouse and country stores to smoke, chew, talk politics, and, in general, to waste time. Many Southern businessmen were unreliable about either paying their bills or delivering goods and services when promised. Among Southerners in general, their improvident spending and the indebtedness to which it often led was widely commented on in the United States and in the places from which their ancestors came in Britain. Even large Southern plantation owners with lavish lifestyles were often deeply in debt. Among the Virginia gentry, extravagant and even ruinous bets on horses were common, according to a scholarly study. Nor were Southerners alert to profitable investment prospects, according to observers in the antebellum South. For example, although there were large coal deposits and a beautiful quality of marble near Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the people there bought coal from Philadelphia, and marble for tombstones was imported from Italy. In antebellum Virginia as well, Olmsted observed the natural resources of the land were strangely unused or were used with poor economy. Nor was he alone in that conclusion. A 20th century scholar also commented on the coal available in Alabama. The Alabama Iron District is one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest, iron district in the entire world. It possesses a phenomenal natural equipment. Jutting out of the hillsides that flank one side of the broad, open valley are thick deposits of iron ore. On the other side of the valley are the coal mines and coke ovens, and the limestone is at hand. Instead of carrying ore 1,000 miles, as at Pittsburgh and the English furnaces, or fuel 600 miles, as at Lake Champlain, the raw materials for these southern furnaces are shifted across the valley by switching engines, and the local supply of cheap black labor helps to give a wonderfully low cost. Yet it was more than 20 years after the Civil War before Birmingham became an iron and steel production center. As for the reasons for the belated development of such a promising combination of natural resources, in spite of the favors of geography, the iron and steel industry in the South was slow in its beginnings and development. Like everything Southern, the industry was retarded by lack of capital and technical skill. Capital was available from outside the South, or indeed from outside the country, as foreign capital was used to finance the building of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Illinois Central during the same era. But the other factors had to be there to create a promising prospect of profitability that would attract investment. The difficulties of developing those other factors in Alabama was shown by the fact that in 1888, Birmingham saw its first ton of steel run through the furnaces of the Henderson Steel Company and burn out the crude furnace linings in the process. Early explorers and settlers in the antebellum South wrote in glowing terms of the wild fruits, especially the wild grapes of unusual size, which excited extravagant hopes of the development of wine industries. Yet early attempts to find a market for Southern wine in Britain were ruined by the fact that a sample of wine that was sent across the Atlantic spoiled in the musty casks in which Southerners had carelessly shipped it. Later efforts to establish a wine industry in the South were undertaken by foreigners, French, German, and Portuguese. A German settlement in Missouri created a wine industry with an annual output of about 100,000 gallons, but the South as a whole produced less than 1/5 of the wine in the United States in 1849, and this was long before the development of the California wine industry. As late as the beginning of the 20th century, there were still laments about the opportunities in the South missed by Southerners and put to use by outsiders with different patterns of behavior. Landowners in Alabama were said to have cheated themselves out of millions of dollars by failing to see the opportunities within their grasp, which lumbermen from the North and East seized by cutting trees and shipping the lumber around the world. Some Southerners along the Gulf Coast likewise spoke of the golden opportunities which they failed to grasp, of the numerous successes of Northern and Eastern men, and lamented the passing of the old school of gentlemen, the midday mint juleps, and the easygoing business methods. Some of these Southerners, however, seemed to prosper working shoulder to shoulder with the Yankees. Not only in the South, but in the communities from which white Southerners had come in the Scottish Highlands, in Ulster and in Wales of an earlier era, most of the successful businessmen were outsiders. Even the poorest Highland Scots would not skin their horses when they died. Instead, Scots sold their dead horses for 3 pence to English soldiers, who in turn got 6 pence for the skinned carcass and another 2 shillings for the hide. This was not due to a lack of knowledge of skinning. In earlier times, when Scotland and England were at war, one of the atrocities committed by the Scots was skinning captured English officers alive. During the 16th century border feuds, the Johnston-Johnson clan adorned their houses with the flayed skins of their enemies, the Maxwells. It was not the skill that was lacking, but the enterprise.
Wow.
Contemporary observers commented on another peculiarity of antebellum Southerners: fording rivers and streams instead of building bridges over them. Nor was this due simply to poverty. A biography of famed 19th century Congressman John Randolph of Virginia referred to the bridgeless streams in the area where elite families like his lived. Thomas Jefferson noted that he had to cross 8 rivers between Monticello and Washington, 5 of which had neither bridges nor boats. This peculiarity was noted in other parts of the South and by observers in those parts of Britain from which Southerners came. Commenting on just how lazy Southerners were, one man noted that no Northern farmer would neglect to build a bridge over a stream that crossed his property. Indeed, 2 live Yankees would complete the work in a single day. But the Southern planter will ford the creek lying between his house and stable a whole lifetime. The same complaint was made about Highland Scots, whose roads were equally bad as those of Ireland and the Old South. In the 1790s, a minister, noting that fords, rather than bridges, crossed streams on one of the most heavily traveled roads in the Highlands, wrote, "From a desire to save labor or time, the ford is often attempted when the river is too high, and the consequence is frequently fatal."
Wow.
Again, it is necessary to emphasize that the culture which Southerners brought over from the parts of Britain from which they came changed in Britain in the years after they left. But all this happened after the ancestors of rednecks and crackers had immigrated to the American South from the outer regions of British society, rather than from central England.
All right, man, I'm gonna stop it there, y'all. We'll stop it there, man. It's, it's crazy, man, how you see the correlation, man, with their culture and our culture, man, how you know, it's we behind, man. We crackers, man. We got a lot of crackers, man.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think so, man. I know so.
Yeah.
And we look at it when we read this book, you see how it's applied every day.
Mm-hmm.
You see why we adopt certain things and how this culture's been marketed against us. Because we taking on the culture of the slave master.
Period, man.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The psychopathy of black folks, man. All right, y'all. I'll take it easy, man. Hey, I'll holler at you later on, Kasu.
Yes, sir.
All right, man, peace.